You see my screen?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, I'll go to presentation. So as Daryl mentioned, this is meant to be just a very high-level overview. Thanks to Daryl and Ian for contributing, and a bunch of other people also gave their input when we reviewed the slides. It in no way covers everything about fog. Ian did an excellent document, so a little more detail than this. But the idea is for those who are new to sailing in fog to give a sense of how it can be done safely. And so the Merrills of the world don't have to freak out, but there are certain guidelines that we as a team here would offer to ensure safe sailing. So here we go. So some basic facts about fog. First of all, fog forms when the temperature dew point spread is less than about 5 degrees, 4.5 to 5 degrees. That's a very useful piece of information because if you have temperature dew point on your boat, if you can monitor it, I've got a little handheld doohickey that can give me those numbers. You can actually tell when you're getting into close to a foggy situation, which I found very useful because it can get the crew ready ahead of time. And then when it does suddenly come around, it's not quite so alarming. There's several types of fog. There's advection fog, which is warm, moist air goes over cold surface, such as the sea. The sea usually is colder than the air above it, the warm, moist air, and you get fog. And that's the typical one we see for when we're sailing, especially.
Testing.
Oh, sorry. Try and put yourself on mute, everyone, because we are recording this, if you can do that. Radiation fog, the surface cools on a clear night and warm air above condenses. Some of you may have seen that when you see beautiful, gentle fog coming over fields. Valley fog is described as cold air in the mountains sinking down to cool, moist air in the valley, and then it forms in the valley. And if you're a little bit higher than that fog, you can see the whole fog blanketing you below in the valley. And then freezing fog, which is quite a dangerous one. Super cool droplets freeze on any surface, any cold surface. So you have these super cool droplets of water. It hasn't formed into ice yet, but anything that is cold at that temperature, and particularly such as an airplane wing or parts of an airplane that's flying through those conditions, will accumulate ice, and it can be very rapid. That's a nasty one. But the main one that us as sailors would worry about is advection fog. So typical day in New England waters, this is going down Narragansett Bay, and we're just passing Newport, and you can see this fog bank ahead of us, which is very typical. And so one, sees the fog bank ahead, and you say, okay, how are we going to handle this? We can't see what's coming from behind us. A couple of people commented this is an important point for everyone. So often you can't see what's coming up behind you, which could be a fast boat, it could be a ferry. And if you're not paying attention, obviously that can be a surprise. You can't see what's in front of you either. And a note here, very quick note, is that the can in this guy's hand is not a beer can because he's nervous about fog, it's an air horn. So that's one of the first things I would recommend is that if you are in a fog situation, as indeed... Can you go on mute, please? I need to see if I can find the mute all. Does anyone know where mute all is on this? I don't know where it is on this one.
Well, all we're trying to do is verify your ID.
Bear with me a second, everyone, while I try and find mute all.
And Sophie, I think that's you. That's somebody's in the background talking.
Yeah. Display settings. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just not seeing mute all on this display. So I'll carry on and hope we won't too many interruptions. So what I was saying is I do recommend that you have someone on the bow with an air horn, and if someone in the midships, by all means, with another air horn. This person's doing two things. He's listening and looking for other boats that we may not have seen on radar and AIS at the cockpit. We'll talk about that in a minute. But also we're calling out to him targets that we've seen, and he'll be looking and listening for those specific targets. So as they come into view, he'll confirm that they're there and their distance. And we said here, radar and AIS may not show all vessels. And indeed, some of these little vessels, I've got here a note, during a trip where we photographed this, we had a small overpowered, and some of these small fishing boats, they'll have up to 300 horsepower engines on some of them. It's quite ludicrous if you look in the harbors. They've got 1,000 horsepower or thereabouts pushing this small, light 30-foot boat I've got 63 horsepower pushing a 46-foot boat that weighs 22,000 pounds. And it came straight at us out of the fog. The term abeam, I'm told, is confusing for Americans. It's the term that I learned to use, meaning something's coming right at your side. And they were coming right at the side of us. And it was only in the last few seconds that they then paid attention. And when they heard our foghorn, veered off, and they gave us a nice wave as if nothing was wrong. They were probably 5 seconds away from splitting us in two. So some suggestions for sailing in fog that we put together. These aren't any way rigorous. Other people have other ways of doing things, of course. This is just some suggestions from the few of us who put this together. The first thing is to have a functioning foghorn and know how to select and select the correct sound sequence for your vessel and activity. So as mentioned on the little story earlier, the automatic foghorn was put on. I will have the different sequences in another slide coming up. But that can be a very useful thing. However, note that the sequences are only required to activate every 2 minutes, which is an awfully long time if you've got a boat doing 30 knots and a guy with a hand on one wheel and a big hand in the other wheel in the fog, which we've seen several times. So that's the first thing. Have a functioning foghorn. If you don't have an automatic one, then of course at least have the manual can foghorns, and make sure you've got a spare can of gas because it does run out fairly quickly. I feel one really should have functioning AIS and radar to go into fog safely. Others will disagree with that, so I'm just expressing a personal opinion. We'll talk about what AIS is and how it helps with radar. Most of you are aware of at least what radar is, and some slides coming out. I've said here have at least one lookout with an air horn. Minimize sound on the boat and listen. Try to minimize chatter, especially the normal dialogue that goes on if everyone's relaxed, and pay attention. Make sure anyone on the boat is looking around, looking behind, listening for other sounds that you may miss. Cross-check your location every opportunity. Look for markers, depth soundings, something that will tell you and confirm that you are where you actually think you are. Particularly for keep a record of your location, time and speed and headings, so that if all electronics fail, you have a heading to get to safety. That may sound a little dramatic, but if you're in fog and everything was to die, which is unlikely, but at least you should know how to get to safety and what direction land is. Again, another personal recommendation is to have at least twice the amount of fuel that you need required to return to safety. Don't go out with marginal amounts of fuel. Can someone else go on mute, please? If everyone can put themselves on mute, it would be a big help. There's a lot of background noise still happening.
Frank, Hauser in the background, Frank.
Yeah, that's gone. Thank you. Do not go leave the dock or cast off if critical equipment is either not functioning or not available. So if you don't have what you consider the minimum for you to be safe, and on my boat that is having functioning AIS and radar, I would not leave personally. Here's a place where we had a bit of discussion about this, whether this is a good suggestion or not. My own choice is I keep the engine running at all times, even if I have the sails up or sailing, in case rapid avoidance is required. I don't want to have a boat coming up on me and I'm going to go into irons and not be able to start the engine, for example. So I leave the engine even if it's idling, if we're sailing. And then the question came up on the discussion we had, is it better the motor or to sail in the fog? And clearly there's two different points of view and different situations you can decide. Motoring, and typically I bring the sails down, does allow me for rapid changes in speed and direction to avoid a collision. However, the downside is engine noise may mask some sounds that otherwise would be heard. And then the other side of it, as Ian says, sailing enhances listening, but does limit maneuverability and visibility, and introduces the more complications of having to sail and tack and all the rest of it. So those are just some personal opinions. Let's get into now to the types of collision avoidance. Really is quite a lot of different things you can use to avoid collisions. Watching and listening by crew, regardless of electronic age. It sounds obvious, but it really is a critical one. Avoid talking and distractions so the captain and crew can concentrate, and hopefully you can contribute individually to looking around. Have a radar reflector. Fiberglass does not reflect radar well. And I would say on our last cruise in fog, we had 2 targets. which were fiberglass, and we didn't see them on radar. It was the lookout who saw them. One was a trimaran, very, very low in the water, which was sailing, and we didn't see it till the lookout saw the trimaran coming out of the fog. It was fortunately going with us, so wasn't a problem there. And the other one was the fishing boat I mentioned to you. We didn't see the fishing boat until he was visible, because again, he didn't show up on radar because he was coming straight at us. So it was a small, low fiberglass hull with just a point, and didn't pick it up. Have a foghorn, automatic or manual, talked about that. I strongly recommend everyone should have automatic identification system known as AIS. I'm going to go into some detail in a subsequent slide about what AIS is. MARPA is the mini automatic radar plotting aid that comes with most modern radars. I'll also show some slides showing you what that is and what it does for you. Target interception is another feature on both AIS and radar, and it basically means that the targets are being tracked and warns if a collision is possible, if it's going in a direction where you could collide. And it can be very helpful at the helm because you get an alert saying, this boat's coming towards you at this speed, and this is the area that you could collide in. Guard zone alarm. This is a zone you can put around the boat in various different shapes. I choose to have a circle at about half a mile that warns me if any target that's seen in either AIS or radar enters that specific zone around the boat, and will give me an alarm at the helm. Then dangerous targets is the alarm you get if those targets have entered the specified zone above. Trails, those are showing like the wake of a boat. I don't use them personally. I find they mess up the screen, but you can turn them on, and what it does is it shows you the history of the targets over time, so you can see where they were, where they're coming from. I don't find that terribly useful, but it's there as an option. And VRM/VB is used to assess distance and bearing of an acquired target. I won't go into that detail here because that's really getting into sort of level 2 on radar, but it's one of the features of radar that allows you to assess the distance and bearing. However, in general, if I have an acquired target, I can see where it is and what speed and so on. And we'll look at that in a slide or so. Let's talk now about the foghorn signals we mentioned earlier. So those are in Collier Rule 35, sound signals in restrictive visibility. And they state that when underway, a vessel shall sound at intervals of not more than 2 minutes the prescribed sound signal. And the prescribed sound signals are listed below, but just for clarity, they talk in terms of prolonged blasts and short blasts. And one has to know that a prolonged blast, can't get the word out, is 4 to 6 seconds, so very long, and a short blast is 1 second. And the automatic system's already built in with these the rules built into them. But if you're using a manual foghorn of any sort, then you'd have to follow those. So if you're underway with a motor, a power-driven vessel making way, that is moving, shall sound 1 prolonged blast every 2 minutes. So every 2 minutes, they're going to go 4 to 6 seconds. If you're stopped and it's a power-driven vessel underway, and by that, it's not a contradiction of terms. Underway technically means you're disconnected from anything. You're not an anchor, you're not on a mooring, you're not at a dock. And so once you're disconnected, technically you're underway, but you can be stopped and underway. You could be just drifting, in which case you have to sound 2 prolonged blasts. Vessel sailing, which we might be doing in fog, or if you're engaged in fishing, towing, or with restricted maneuverability, so dredges, for example, have 1 prolonged blast followed by 2 short blasts. So the automatic systems, when you set them to the mode of sailing, then you'd have 1 blast followed by 2 short blasts. If I'm motoring, as in my case in fog, I would just get the 1 long blast every 2 minutes because I'm underway with motor. But then a couple of more details. There's a lot more different sound signals. I put a couple here just for example. The vessel's being towed, 1 prolonged blast followed by 3 short blasts. And thanks to Daryl for pointing out that that's the vessel being towed, the one behind, not the one doing the towing, because I got confused myself on those rules. And then finally, if you're a pilot vessel, which none of us would be, but if you heard it, it'd be 4 short blasts, in addition to the sound signals required by a power-driven vessel. And so see Colregs for all those sound signals. So that's quite a headful. Bottom line really for our environments is on our sailboats, if you're motoring, you need one prolonged blast. 5 seconds is what I keep in mind, the 4 to 6. And if you're sailing, then you need one prolonged blast followed by 2 short blasts. Okay, now let's talk about AIS and radar.
Alex, maybe we should stop for a second and see if there's any questions.
Okay. Okay, go ahead. Take yourself off mute if you're on mute. You're unintelligible, Bruce. You're totally unintelligible. No, you're afraid you're unintelligible. I don't know if it's your Wi-Fi, but you're showing up as mute and off mute. Yeah.
Bruce, you may want to turn off your video while you're talking, just so you have enough bandwidth.
That might help. Okay. Any other questions? Oh, okay, well, I'll carry on then. So this is a chart of where I sail and keep my boat. And the intent of this chart is to just show you what a chart plotter looks like with AIS enabled and radar is off. So the AIS targets are these blue-gray targets here. They're rather small, and as Craig pointed out, they're a little difficult to see if you're not familiar with this. But down here in this corner here, you've got 2. Notice one looks like a sailboat. And when you configure AIS and buy it for your boat and have it installed and configured, if it's a sailboat, they should configure this symbol for it. I have seen several sailboats where that has not been done. And this little triangle, the pointed triangle, means it's a motor vessel. So what you're seeing here is 2 motor vessels up here. The big black vessel is Zanzibar itself, showing up as a black object with a line in front of it. And then there's a couple down here. So that's what AIS looks like. And these are obviously in the harbor. So the interesting thing with AIS, I think, is that it's VHF, which is, I think, Daryl, you pointed out, is indeed line of sight, or maybe it was Ian. But however, you can see things a long way away and which are out of sight. So in this example, I'm still up where I was up here, which is in Greenwich Bay, and something like 12 nautical miles away, I've got Newport, and you can see an AIS target. You can even see it's behind an island. So this is an AIS target. This is another AIS target here, not to be confused with these bridge symbols here. So the nice thing about AIS, it can really give you good information, even on things that are not immediately visible to you and you know, around a corner or over an island. So there's a couple of types of AIS. There's AIS Class A transmits at fairly high powered, and it's required, it's 12.5 watts, required on commercial vessels, 60 feet or more in length, and some tow vessels. AIS Class B is at lower power, and it's typically pleasure boats, and that's, for example, what Zanzibar has. And there are other technical differences that I haven't gone into here that aren't really relevant. AIS can be purchased as listen only. What that means is that you can see other AIS targets, but they cannot see you. I see no point in buying that way. I mean, half of the value of AIS is that people can see you and see your information. Also, some AIS units can be put in stealth mode, so they do not transmit, which sounds a strange thing to do when you've paid for that capability, but it turns out that fishermen often will go into stealth mode because they don't want to expose their location when they're fishing, which also means they're not visible on AIS by other people. And to give you an idea, AIS listen only is about 450 and transmit was 750 as some numbers they came up with. So, clearly there's additional installation costs on top of that, but for the safety it gives you and the capabilities that AIS has is just amazing. Especially, I'll repeat it, most commercial vessels now are required to have AIS. There are some that don't have it or they have it turned off, but in general, nearly all the commercial vessels, for example, the ferries that go to Block Island and Martha's Vineyard, we can see those very clearly.
Alex, if I could just plug in also,
yeah, go ahead.
Lobster boats, though smaller than a certain length, don't have to use Class A, but can use Class B, are required to use Class B, lobster boats. But Ian makes the point in his document that a lot of these lobster boats up in Maine are sort of hedging their bets or trying to keep their secrecy about their locations to other lobstermen, where their traps are, whatever, but they frequently turn off to a stealth mode, as Alex is mentioning here, but they are required to be at least class B.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I actually sent a note to the Coast Guard about that, and they came back with a very vague response. Needless to say, okay, thanks.
Okay, well now let's get into radar a little bit. So here's radar at the slide you saw earlier, a location where I keep Zanzibar, and it's centered on Zanzibar. You've got targets visible to the east of the bay. So over here, this looks like it's probably a target. This looks like it's a target. This may be a target. All of this stuff here, I happen to know is the cliffs. It's not targets, but if you didn't know any better or you're in an unsure area, you know, for example, trying to differentiate whether this is a target or something on the land that's being reflected is very hard to judge. You can tune radar. There's a lot of tuning factors. I'll list some of them in a minute, but it takes experience to do it, and you need to understand the implications. You can't just go twiddling knobs and see what happens. So to that point on tuning, there's several characteristics that can be tuned. The gain, which adjusts how sensitivity to the return. So you're going to see more targets and smaller targets if you increase the gain, but you're also going to get a lot of noise. Clutter specifically is to adjust the rejection of waves. So when you have high gain, the waves around the boat, especially if they're big waves, if it's not a calm day, will reflect radar around the boat and cause this whole area around the boat is basically blind. There's no visibility there. Clutter is a very clever feature they put into the software of the radar, or the hardware, I guess, to reject that wave so you can see a target through that. Clutter is always a bit of a problem because you can't reject it all or reject the targets, but it's a very important feature. And then there's also a setting for adjusting rain. As rain comes down, the raindrops are seen by radar, some radars at least, as noise, and can often cause a cloudy effect across the radar and blind you. Modern radar may have some automatic tuning for specific situations. And I listed some here that I've got on my set of Raymarine. I can set it for a buoy, if I'm looking for buoys, for example, specifically. I can set it for harbor, which is what I generally have it set to. And in harbor mode, it's actually capable of picking up a piling 30 feet away from you, which is really quite fun. Coastal mode, when you want a little further range, and not quite as sensitive, and then offshore, if you're really out in the middle of the ocean somewhere, you can also set it to look for birds and look for weather. But each of these will do different adjustments to the tuning of the system per the experts who set it up for you. I will tell you a very brief story here about radar and its returns. So we were in some fog, this is a couple of seasons ago, and just out in Buzzards Bay. And the guy on the bow, the one with the beer can, actually the same guy, called out to me and said, I see a bunch of targets in front of you on the starboard bow. And I looked and I said, yeah, I see them. I'm calling them out. Sorry, I got that backwards. I called out to him that I could see targets on the starboard bow, and he was looking, and he said he couldn't see anything. And we were coming up close upon them. They were very small and intermittent, so I wasn't too worried about running into something hard, but it was still concerning. And we were going to miss them. I went to the side of them. And as we got really close to them, the guy on the bow said, well, I don't see any targets, boats. All I see is some seagulls here. And sure enough, the seagulls took off, and those were the targets. They disappeared. I wouldn't have believed it myself if I didn't think the radar could actually pick up seagulls. And they didn't have little aluminum caps on as radar reflectors, I can tell you. Okay, so going back to the radar in Greenwich Bay, let's talk about MARPA. So MARPA stands for Mini Automatic Radar Plotting Aid. And it's a really incredibly powerful feature that I use a great deal in fog. When you have a target that you think might be of interest to you, and by that I mean one you're concerned about, that could be a collision or is heading in your direction or for whatever reason, you can come up with your cursor and click on it, and then some little dots appear around it. And the radar will then watch for some number of returns, depending on how strong they are. It wants to see several strong returns. But once it gets that return, it'll then lock on it with this little green circle and a line. It tells you the heading from you, and it tells you the speed of the boat, and the line tells you the direction it's going. And so my system will handle up to 10 targets at a time. So as I'm moving forward, anything I see in front of me and the front 90 degrees that I think might be a risk, I'll tend to target. So a very powerful feature. Now let's talk about, we've looked at radar. It's very confusing, needs a lot of knowledge and local knowledge to know where your cliffs are and what you're really seeing. I feel the real value of this whole thing is when radar can overlay your chart plotter. And that's what you're seeing here now. You're seeing exactly the same screenshot here. You'll notice this red here, and that's now being overlaid. And you can immediately see that these are the cliffs. You can see a bunch of AIS targets because the AIS is overlaid as well. And you can see some targets out here that are not AIS. So this is a target here. Here's one I'm tracking. There's a MARPA target I'm keeping an eye on. All these here are targets. It even picks up the buoy. Notice here, this little marker here is shown here. Most radar does produce a streak for an individual target, and you have to get used to living with that and identifying it. It's just the way radar works. So that little streak there is for that buoy, and this streak here is for a target that is identified at this end. So here's just again a personal opinion of a safe way to handle fog. If you don't have the equipment or the people on board to help you, I really strongly recommend you just stay at your mooring or your slip, or basically don't go out, because fog is very dangerous. It really is, as we all know. And it's not necessarily yourself that's dangerous. You might know where you are, and you might have a good GPS and a backup GPS, but it really is I hate to say it and put disparaging comments, but in my own experience, it's the small power boaters, typically fishing boats, but not necessarily, with, I'll say, young men in them, generally going way too fast and way too cavalier for the situation, that scare the crap out of me. And then finally, fog can also be beautiful. This was a gorgeous night up in Nantucket, and it was just stunning. We really enjoyed it. The fog came and went, and by the following morning, fortunately, it was clear, and we had a great evening. And that's it. Any questions? Please take yourself off mute.
I have some questions.
Hi, Michelle, go ahead.
Hi, first question is, at what distance do you think is a good distance for setting your radar?
Well, great
you know.
question. One of the features that I didn't mention here for simplicity is that the radar can be synced to your GPS. So as you change the range in your GPS, the radar automatically changes its range to match. And so the question then becomes, what range do you want when you're in fog? I would say for myself, I generally had it at half a nautical mile, sometimes a mile, because I want to see what's coming up upon me. I want it to have high enough resolution that I can see stuff very close to me. So I go out to 2 miles or 3 miles, I may miss something small. So that's my general guidelines, but I would also then every so often zoom out, Michelle, so I know where I'm going and look at what's around me for 5 miles, let's say. But that would be my answer to you, something like half a mile or thereabouts. What was your other question?
AIS, does it, what are there requirements of what the radar has to be for, let's say I have really old radar. Can I just go out and buy AIS?
Well, they're two totally different systems. First of all, they have nothing to do with each other.
Yeah.
So if you wanted AIS, it's really more the question is, can AIS be superimposed on your chart plotter? And I'm going to defer to Daryl in a minute, who's more into technology, I think, than I am. But I believe the cornerstone of it will be what bus you have. And you need to then get an AIS system that can communicate on your bus. And your chart plotter has to be on that bus to then look at those AIS targets. Nothing to do with the radar. I would say, however, though, if you want to overlay your radar, it may be that in my case, for example, I had an old analog radar, and I wasn't able to do that without changing the radar to digital, so it matched the bus. Again, nothing to do with AIS. It was just it wasn't incompatible. But I'm going to defer to Daryl. Any other thoughts, Daryl, on that?
Well, yeah, you just made the point. Some of the older analog radars, which may be the case for Michelle. And by the way, Alex, you could probably switch to our pictures at this point if you want, but on screen. But yeah, that's the point. A digital radar is probably what is required. Actually, Ian is probably more the expert on this than I am by a long shot. Do you have any comments on that, Ian?
Well, as Alex said, it's not, the AIS has nothing to do with the radar system. If you don't have AIS and you're looking to upgrade your VHF, you could well just go and buy a VHF which has an AIS receiver built into it. Many of them will actually just give you a text readout of all AIS targets in range order or alphabetic order if you happen to know the name of something you're looking for. So I actually have an AIS receiver transmitter on my boat, a transponder, but as a backup, the VHF actually independently lists the AIS targets. I mean, you wouldn't want to use it, but if you had to, you can scroll down the list of targets and see who's there and how far away they are.
VHF meaning the radio?
On the VHF radio, yeah.
Because remember, AIS works over VHF, Michelle.
AIS is VHF radio. I'll just point out, if you're installing an AIS with a transponder, then, and you will have a VHF on your boat, you also need to put in an antenna switch, because the AIS needs to take over and transmit every few seconds, and it can't do that with your transmitter hooked up to the antenna. And so there's an additional couple of $100 you need to spend, so that when you push the transmit button on your VHF, it automatically switches over and you get priority. But when you're not transmitting, the AIS can transmit whenever it wants, and it doesn't destroy your transmitter. So there's a couple of pieces.
Sorry. Michelle, on your first question is which range you like on your radar. I find it's very similar to which range you like on your chart plotter. In tighter situations and closer into the harbor where there are more targets around, you want to be a much closer range. When you're out offshore in the middle, where you're several miles from things, you want to be further out. Simple as that.
Okay.
And on Alex's screen, he had an awful lot of targets there, but if you're like in the middle of Buzz's Bay, you'd probably want to have it so you could see one shore and what's around you between that. It kind of gives you a good reference, and then it will also show you what's there. The chart overlay is wonderful because as you showed there, if you see a little magenta mark right next to a buoy, you'll say, gee, that must be the buoy. If you see a magenta mark and there's no buoy there, it's probably a boat.
One other thought for you, Michelle, is I was someone radioed me when we were in fog, saying that they saw us on AIS. I looked and I didn't see them on our AIS, but I did see a radar target that was about where they said they were. And I said, I don't see your AIS, I just see you on radar. And they said, oh no, we don't have AIS. It's an application on my iPad. And I'm just looking at that. So you do have other options if you don't want to spend the money.
Okay.
Any other questions, Michelle?
I might jump in and put up a contrary view about ranges.
What?
I actually, if the fog is dense, I'll actually split my chart plotter screen into a chart on one side and a radar display on the other, and I'll leave the chart running at maybe 5 or 10 miles to give me my course and my coastal overlay, and I'll have the radar on the other side set at 1/8 of a mile. Because if you set it out much more than 1/8 of a mile, you could have 50 targets that you're looking at, and most of them could be stationary. Some of them could be buoys, day marks, some of them are lobster boats. And when you can only see 20 yards, that's too much information. So I have actually run my radar in down at 1/8 of a mile when I'm in dense fog, but I'll keep my chart plotter out at 3 miles.
It's down to how many? I didn't quite hear. Down to.
I've come down to 1/8 of a mile. I
An
can
eighth
zoom
of a mile?
independently on the two. Yeah, it
Okay.
depends on how heavy the fog is, Michelle. If it's, if I can see 500 yards, I'll turn it out to a few miles. But if I can't see that far, I want to know what's close. And it's usually just a quick turn of a knob to change the range.
Okay. Well, I used to have terrible arguments with my sailing partner when we're going across Buzzards Bay in severe fog. I like it like a mile or two, and with occasionally turning it for the distance, and he wanted it at a tenth of a mile. I said, well, that's really good if you want to see what's going to hit you, but it's a little bit too close for my comfort.
Yeah.
So, okay.
But the importance of the VHF radio is major here, in that and those of us that don't have AIS considering upgrading would do it by simply buying a new VHF radio. And at the same time, we'd probably want to get one with a loud hailer / foghorn feature, which is from that original story you heard that Chuck told us, was what Will had on his boat. And it's a matter of buying the right equipment, really, for most of us. But realize that most pleasure boats that are looking at our AIS are doing so without transmitter. I'm saying, I'm making my own personal judgment here, and I don't know if Ian and Alex would agree, but I think a large proportion of the boats out there are in receive mode only, because you can buy a receiver very cheaply without going the VHF radio route. And plus, I think there's an installation factor. I think no, I'm sorry. But what I'm getting at is that AIS has limitations, because a lot of people are not transmitting, even if they are receiving. And as we spoke about the lobster boats as an example, well, Ian gave us that example up in Maine. He sees this all the time. And it's not legal technically for them to do that, but all they have to do is throw a toggle switch and they can blip off your screen.
How expensive approximately is the VHF with the AIS? What would your...
That's a good question, Michelle. I've forgotten. I can find out how much I paid for mine. I think it was probably about $700.
Okay.
Let me see if I can say something. We're talking about all sorts of newfangled stuff. I haven't heard the words radar reflector mentioned all night. Over.
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier in one of the slides.
Yeah.
It's one of the things to have.
Well, I have a
It was
short
definitely
memory. Let's emphasize it again. It's the simplest thing you can do.
Yep, absolutely. And very cheap and passive, so it's not going to break.
Right, this
So
is
the other thing
yeah,
you might want to do is also turn on your running lights, particularly if it's foggy at night.
hey, this is just an observation, but the last 4 times I was in fog, it's like I'm the only one blowing a horn, and I'm usually feeling, well, I'm in their territory, I'm new, and this is just a ho-hum to them. Is that everybody's experience, or is that just a weird occurrence for me?
I agree, Ken. You don't hear a lot of private boats, except for the big commercial boats in Boston Harbor. Very rarely do they run the foghorns. And
Right.
on Bruce's,
I hear them, and then they come out of the fog, and they said, "Oh shit!" Well, okay, but I'm blasting my horn. But and the other thing, as far as horns, especially in Maine, I went through the gas so damn fast. When we stopped, we got mouth ones. They just rely upon your own breath, because that gas is gone, you're out of luck.
I think you've just answered your first question. People don't do it all the time because they run out of gas or they have to blow too much. Okay, it's really simple. Like if we didn't have an electronic one, I wouldn't be sounding off the gas every 2 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, I try to be very good about the horn, but it's tiring to do it every 2 minutes. And
Yep.
you can't keep that up in a sustained period.
I once went out with a boat. It was a classic schooner, and we got caught in the fog. And the owner really liked ringing the bell, even though we were underway. He was ringing the bell. And you know, letting people know he was anchored when he was really sailing. So I thought that was great. But he liked the sound of the bell better than the horn. So
Well, the gas cans are darn expensive, and that's why many people don't use their foghorn when they should be. And never mind the fact that you're going to scare the heck out of the guy standing watching the bow. But there are electronic foghorns, as we described already. And there's another technique would be to use an air horn, like a truck you can buy at the auto parts stores, an air horn system. And those can be quite loud too. That's something you could hoist up to your spreaders with a hose to pneumatically operate the air horn. So that's another way to go.
I think I have something that you up, but I haven't used it in so long, I can't remember.
When I say air horn, I'm talking about a compressor-driven air horn. You have a 12-volt compressor. You hit the button, the compressor turns on, blasts the horn, and that's that. So you're not running out of the critical gas.
Any other questions? If not, I'll stop the recording and people.
It's Brian. If I could make just a couple of observations. First of all, thank you for putting this together. It was great. I recently upgraded last year with the Axiom Plus stuff, which is only about a year old now, from Raymarine. And just want to make the point that they do not, and the old Raymarine had a radar overlay. The new technology doesn't permit that. And it forces you to do AIS over GPS. And by the way, I love it. So you'll run the GPS and you'll show the AIS targets on one screen. My preference is to run that north up. And then on a split screen, it'll show the radar. And I run that head up, you know, with the direction of the boat. And like, I think it was Ian, so someone made the comment, having the GPS a little further out, and I tend to run the radar as a closer range and have those on separate ranges. The other point I wanted to make, which I don't think was mentioned, was on the Doppler radar. As you hinted at in some of your conversations, I found I had radar. I found radar to be practically useless. I far prefer to use the AIS, and I tend to think of the radar more as a backup. And with the Doppler radar, it's life changing. So anything that's coming at you is lit up red, and anything that's going away from you is lit up green. And then the rest of it all looks like oatmeal, the way it always did. So you can instantly identify the targets that are coming at you, and then you can use the technology that you described, where you have the radar target and you acquire it. But you know, as an example, I was coming out of Booth Bay in heavy fog about a month ago. There were 2 or 3 targets. You see them in red, you discard the oatmeal and the green, and then you just tap on those, and then you can get the speed and so forth as you described. And so just as a comment, that's what I find works well for me.
So can I chuck in a couple of other things that haven't been mentioned? Alex mentioned recording your position and your GPS, etc. One of my first rules is, as soon as the fog rolls in, the paper chart is in the cockpit. Okay. If your electronics goes, you don't want to be running down below looking for your paper chart and a pencil. Okay. You've got it in the cockpit. If you've got a spare crew member, transfer your GPS coordinates to them, get them to cross-check it, annotate it on the chart, check the depth, call it back. Okay. So when everything goes dark, you know where you are. And the other thing is, don't be afraid to use your VHF proactively and use a security call. If you're up in Maine, you will hear every ferry as it leaves the dock issue security. You will hear kayakers when they're crossing a channel issue securities, because they don't show up real well on radar. Okay. If you're coming into a harbour and you can see 20 yards, call out a security, tell people that you're coming in. Okay. They will appreciate it.
It's worth mentioning, Ian, that with AIS, another feature of that is that you can click on it and it gives you typically the name of the boat and also some other details, length and size and speed. But by clicking on it, you get the name of it, and then I'll call them up on channel 16 and say, you know, boat X, we're seeing you, we're coming off, crossing your starboard bow. And then if they're monitoring the radio, which certainly the commercial boats do, the private boats sometimes just ignore me, but at least you've made a call and hopefully someone answers. I found that particularly helpful with the high-speed ferries, because when I go over to Block Island or Martha's Vineyard, there's always a high-speed ferry nearabouts, and in radar they can be quite spooky because they're doing, you know, 30 knots or plus, and cover a lot of ground very quickly. So I made a habit now of calling them, and you know, getting two-way communication well ahead of any chance for an accident.
Yeah, you're right, and they're usually quite appreciative of it too when you do it. And some
speaking
systems,
from experience, that they absolutely do appreciate it, because they're up there. Because I've been in the wheelhouse on fast ferries and not captaining, but as crew. But I'll tell you, when you see people doing really nutty things, you don't know what they're doing. If someone calls you and say, "Hey, we're doing this," it's like, wow, at least that's one person I don't have to worry about. I don't have to worry about the other 95 yahoos out there. So.
Ian, you mentioned Ian on sailing, and it was actually Alex also mentioned it versus motoring. I really liked what you said in your article that you sent out today, that Daryl sent out today, about sailing. It works for several things. Number one, it definitely helps on hearing things a lot better. But it also is much better tactically, meaning if I start to get off course, I'm likely to luff, or I'm going to be heeling over more, or I'm going to feel it a lot more than when you're motoring. When you're motoring, you don't notice that you all of a sudden turn 45 degrees. Another thing that works incredibly well in the fog is auto helm. Auto helm in the fog doesn't get distracted and all of a sudden start going off to one way or the other. Use your auto helm a lot, and marking the charts, or just marking every time you go by your buoy. Say that you went by buoy number 2 at 10:44, and that your course was such and such. That is a wonderful fix. You can't get any better fix than if you knew that you were going by the such and such a harbor at a certain time, and you're going this speed in that direction.
I would add to that, Craig, and say that I will typically navigate intentionally so I can see the buoys and verify the buoys, as opposed to saying, well, there's one over there somewhere, but you know, who cares?
Right, and actually go close enough so you can read the number to make sure that you got the right one.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, just watch out when you're doing that. You'll probably find there's half a dozen other people doing the same thing, and some of them might have AIS. That's happened to me around Best Bay Harbour. You'll find there's 3 or 4 vessels turn up at the buoy.
Yeah, I've had that happen too. This is the kind of thing I keep for my backup. So if I run out of air, I have a way to pump up one by hand, and so I always have air. This one I just found at Walmart for $39.
What is it?
We had one of those, and that's very tiring after a while.
Yeah.
It's got a little hand pump, like a bicycle pump, that you can put air in so you get more air. So keep extra on hand, but if you do run out, this is your backup. So
you'll find your long blasts are more like 3 seconds rather than 5, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now just so we can carry on chatting and it won't be too huge a recording. Okay, here we go.